And so we meet again. I'm glad you could stop by. This is the second entry into my Backroads journal. Today's entry I will call My 2 Cents, where I will offer you my observations and candid opinions about matters of contention. This episode centers around preparedness and how one should look at and behave in this ever-changing world around us. I should warn you that it does contain some colorful language, so if there are any children or those with delicate ears close by, you may want to slip on your headphones or simply close the door. The following are a few observations about how I see life today and a story as told to me by a friend. After listening to his story, I found there is a lesson to be learned in how we can better interpret what is going on around us. And here's what I learned. Have you noticed how people nowadays seem to have such little concern for their fellow citizen? What has made so many so self-absorbed that they act as though the world is there for their own entertainment? Common courtesy is no longer that common. An example, while driving the other day, I was in the right lane waiting for my exit, which was still 2 more exits down. There was nobody behind me for at least 4 or 5 car lengths. As I'm approaching the first exit, a car flies past me in the middle lane, cuts right in front of me, and exits at the last possible moment. Had the driver waited any longer to exit, they would have taken out the guardrail and crash cushion that protects motorists from colliding with the overpass. Had I not braked really hard, they would have clipped my left front bumper. Common sense would have suggested that the driver simply slow down, slide in behind me, and exit. They didn't even need to use their turn signal, as if that was ever going to happen. They had to simply slow down for the exit anyway, so why didn't they do that? I'm not surprised by this, but disgusted nonetheless. The driver seemed to have no concern for anyone, especially me or the other occupants in that vehicle. As it was happening, I looked over to my right and caught a glimpse of the occupants. The driver, a 20-something skank in an oxidized red 1970s Ford Fairmont with a cracked windshield and one door painted in primer gray. She had one of those little temporary wheels on the front. It looked like it was ready to go any time. The muffler was dragging and sparks were flying out from under the car. One couldn't help noticing the car was sporting the remnants of a vinyl roof as it was flapping in the wind, just like the cloth headliner inside. It looked like one of those vehicles abandoned along the highway of death in the Gulf War. She was reclined in her seat with her left foot propped up on the left side of the dash, smoking a cigarette, and of course, she had a phone stuck to her head. In the back seat were what appeared to be 2 kids. One looked like he, or she, may have had green hair. Their heads were bowed as if in prayer. Fat chance of that happening. These 2 were probably clicking away on their smartphones, self-absorbed in their own little worlds. At one time, I would have honked my horn, maybe flipped them off. But what good does it do other than distract me from my driving and pissing me off even more? Reacting like that doesn't change anything. It just gives some lowlife an excuse to pull a gun and shoot at someone. Road rage. Nowadays, that's a real concern. So, is this what our society has become? I was having lunch that day with a group of people with whom I do volunteer work. I told some of the others this story, and the comment I heard the most were something like, Jesus may love her, but everyone else outside her trailer park probably thinks she's an asshole. Not really the response I was expecting from this group of people. Some said they were just tired and frustrated with today's society. Another observation. In the South, it's customary for men to hold the door for women, children, and the elderly. This has been pretty commonplace up until recently, as folks from other parts of the country where this is not so common have moved into the South. Other than in rural areas and smaller cities and towns, one doesn't see this quite as often. For instance, when walking into a store, I would glance back, and if I noticed even a guy was a step or two behind me, I'd pause, hold the door for him to grab, and say something like, "Good morning," go about my business. The other day I was walking into a store and, as usual, looked back to see if anyone was behind me. Well, a lady with a small child was a few steps back, so I stepped aside to hold the door for her and waited. She saw me, and as she was walking up, she thanked me and took the hand of her cute little girl just to hurry her along. Little girl was dressed in a pink sundress with a matching bow in her hair. She just looked up, smiling, and giggled. It took all of 8 seconds out of my day to do this. But just as this was happening, this thoughtless freak of nature with earplugs in and his jeans halfway down his ass made a move to slide right in front of them. He almost walked over the little girl. But did he care or even notice? Clearly not. It seemed as he was too busy texting his friends or something to notice. Did it even cross his mind why someone was standing there holding the door? I doubt it. He probably wasn't brought up that way. So why say anything? It wouldn't improve his manners. Of course, by then, it really didn't matter, as I had let go of the door handle and it closed. He didn't notice it until it was too late and ran his head right into the edge of the door. Bang! Too many freaks, not enough circuses. By the way, the lady and her daughter didn't notice the headbanging incident, as a gentleman coming out a door closer to her saw her coming and held the door for her too. When the freak cut in front of her, the lady didn't miss a beat and walked through the other open door. Sadly, she seems to have gotten used to this type of behavior. And so are we now to expect this lack of concern and disrespect from society to continue? Do you think these people even respect themselves? There's got to be something wrong with them, right? Look at their behavior. Inconsiderate, impatient, impulsive people. You know who I'm talking about is, most of you have probably seen them far too many times. The ones you stay away from because they are dirty, smelly, probably on drugs, and may very well assault you. Is this what life today has taught us? Perhaps. Perhaps not. You know, the skank may not physically assault you, but she did show total disregard for those around her by driving like an idiot. Maybe there is a legitimate reason she was forced to drive that crappy car. But did she have to operate it like she was in a Mad Max movie? That's irresponsible. No concern for herself or others. Now consider how you would react when encountering one of these cretins in a true civil unrest situation. You've seen their type before, and you would probably act accordingly. These people stick out in your mind. Your gut tells you they could be a problem. While you're thinking about those other people's behavior, also consider this. I spoke with a couple that had to evacuate Houston, Texas ahead of Hurricane Rita. The man I'll call Mike. He's married with 2 kids. He's an accountant and lives a typical middle-class American life, and always has. Katrina was still fresh on his mind, so being somewhat of an organized guy, Mike already had his wife's minivan packed with a few essential items he needed for himself, his wife, and his 2 kids, just in case he needed to get out of Dodge. Well, it was that time, and they decided not to wait any longer. They were preparing to evacuate ahead of the rush. They added some extra clothes, more food, snacks, and with their important documents, and also other valuables. As Mike was listening to the TV while he was organizing, he decided to include a few other items, which included 2 5-gallon gas cans, which he would fill up when he filled up the minivan. On their way out, Mike stopped at the local Walmart and also bought a couple cases of bottled water and some ice for the cooler, and having remembered to grab his good flashlight from his pickup, he also bought some new batteries. He filled the gas cans and put them on the luggage rack with the duffel bags, placed the full cooler in the back behind the kid's seat, and with fresh batteries in the flashlight, placed it underneath the driver's seat. He was ready to head out. The mood was light. The kids thought they were just going on a regular trip to Grandma and Grandpa's house. What fun! As they were heading out of town and making their way to the interstate, Mike heard on the news that the traffic was bad and getting worse, and people should plan accordingly. They were heading north to Dallas, so he planned on taking I-45 and would take a side route if it got too congested. He didn't know where. He just figured he'd pick an exit when necessary, depending on the road conditions. He was comfortable with this plan as he knew the area between Houston and Dallas pretty well. Well, it didn't take long for them to realize most of Harris County, which includes Houston, were also evacuating at that time, and the highways showed it. His first thought was that the traffic would even out, as he put it, after they got out of the more populated areas. But after it was too late to do anything about it, Mike found he was funneled onto the highway that was a designated hurricane evacuation route. People from certain zones are directed toward predetermined cities and were not allowed to exit their designated routes except for emergencies or food and gas. Mike knew this was going to leave fewer places available for those people to get the essential items that may have forgotten to and left everything at home. He was glad he made the effort to stock up on those necessities. As the family was driving, the traffic got even worse. At times, it was a complete standstill, bumper to bumper. It was later reported that 2.5 to 3.7 million people fled the Houston area prior to Rita's landfall. Mike thought at the time that most of them were right ahead of him. There were cars for as far as one could see. This happened in mid-September, and in Texas, it's still hot enough to need your AC. As with everyone else, they were burning through their gas pretty fast since they were spending most of the time crawling along or even stopped with the AC running. Many tried turning off the AC and rolling down the windows to save fuel. Mike and others turned the vehicles off a number of times when they were not moving at all. The hours just seemed to crawl by. It was hot and getting more miserable. Sooner or later, those kids were going to get hot and cranky. Probably Mike and his wife will too, as they felt the stress level rising right along with the thermometer. There was a point when the traffic stopped for an extended period of time. He later found out it was a wreck at the construction area a few miles ahead of them. And since he had a chance, Mike decided to get out and empty the gas cans into the tank. They had used that much gas already. So he gets out, reaches up to the luggage rack, unlocks the lid, and opens it and grabs the first can. At that point, he said he felt the odd sensation he was being watched. He described the feeling as what one might feel like while on a Broadway stage. Everybody was looking his way. Feeling uneasy, he finished emptying the first can, put the empty back, secured the cover on the luggage rack, locked it, and got back in. Once back in the minivan, he looked around and noticed the people still looking at him. Not just a few, everyone around him. A few people even got out and stood next to their vehicles while looking back at Mike. Can you imagine the uncomfortable feeling Mike and his wife were experiencing? Soon after, a dirty, sweaty, unshaven, scruffy-looking guy walks up to Mike's window. His clothes were stained with grease and his hands were filthy. He was wearing a Firestone Auto Center shirt with an iron-on name tag that said Buddy on it. Mike rolls down the window and Buddy asks if he can borrow a little gas as he is about to run out. Mike apologizes and says he has just enough to get him to his family's place. He tries to explain to Buddy that his son has asthma and needs to stay as cool as possible, so they're having to run the AC more. That makes the gas go quicker. Buddy makes a snide comment, but just goes back to his vehicle. What else can he say? Still more time in traffic that is barely moving. The people are getting more restless and more agitated. It's still hot out, and it adds to the stress. Then the radio starts announcing that the gas stations on the hurricane evacuation routes, including the route Mike has been forced to take, are out of fuel, food, bottled water, ice, and antifreeze. Yeah, old cars are starting to boil over right along with some tempers. They're still a good 2 hours away from Mike's folks' house, based on normal traffic flow. Who knows how long it's going to take at this rate? Hotels and motels were reported as being full, and the hurricane was approaching. Everyone must accept that they have to wait it out and go with the flow, or actually lack of it. Soon Mike notices people have begun congregating along the sides of the highway and in the median on both sides. You see, all lanes of traffic are changed so that they are heading in one direction, out. Just picture in your mind the number of vehicles crammed onto that highway. Mike had been trying to call his parents, but the cell towers were overloaded on account of the number of people concentrated in this more rural area. Nobody planned for this many people to be on this stretch of highway at one time. But Mike's wife said she'd keep trying. Vehicles were running out of gas, overheating, or simply breaking down. Mike figured, considering all that was happening and that people were being forced to get out of their vehicles, that it wouldn't take long before arguments started. Well, he was right. Blended in with the acrid fumes of hot car exhaust was a smell of tension. It was getting that noticeable. As they drove by, Mike and his family were now seeing the anger and resentment on the faces of those in those stranded cars. These people had run out of gas or simply broke down and were being told to push their vehicles to the shoulders so others could keep moving. Nobody was stopping to help anyone else. It was every man for himself. Seeing the agitation this was causing, Mike decided to have his wife roll up her window halfway, just in case. At one point, as they were just crawling along, it was when Mike quickly realized that the vehicle directly in front of him had run out of gas. Two men then got out to push their truck to the shoulder. Just as they started the push, one of the men stops and then steps toward Mike's minivan. He then puts up his hand for Mike to stop. Mike does and rolls down his window so he can speak to him. The man says, "I know you have extra gas. in that other can, and I need it. I'll give you $40, and that's all I have. I need to get home and close up my house. Mike gives the guy the same explanation as he did Buddy. Remember Buddy? Judging by his appearance, Mike felt this guy would be reasonable. Middle-aged guy wearing khaki pants and a short-sleeved sports shirt and the Houston Rockets ball cap, driving a nice pickup truck. Looked like a typical guy. Mike knows he won't be happy, but he'll resign himself to accept it like Buddy had. Well, not this time. During this exchange, the man's friend walks up so he can listen. He then goes over to the passenger side of the minivan and starts talking Jack to Mike's wife. She becomes distraught, so Mike leans over and tells him to back off. The guy steps away, but moves to the rear window, bends over and looks in at Mike's 12-year-old daughter. Well, with all that's been going on, she's had enough and begins to cry. The mother looks more panicked. The boy is asking questions about why this man is here. He's frightened. He just wants to go home. Mike is growing very concerned. Then the scruffy-looking guy who is bending over and looking in Mike's daughter's window turns and looks at Mike. He stares him down for a few seconds and then says, while motioning towards the girl, "Give us the gas, or since we have to wait, we'll just take your daughter with us and have some fun with her." Mike sees him chuckle and then turns to the first guy just in time to notice the sick grin on his face. Mike is stunned. He wonders if they would truly harm his daughter. If not that, what would they do? They do seem determined. Well, the mother has had enough and freaks out. Both kids are now crying, and Mike looks around, and there is nobody to stand with him. So what does a man do? Give the guy the gas, knowing that even if he does, these scumbags aren't going away. They're all stuck in the same traffic jam. Or maybe if he did give it to them, that threat from these guys would be gone. Plus, the other motorists would now realize that Mike is in the same situation they are in. The only gas you have is in your tank. Plus, traffic should be moving pretty soon anyway. But if Mike does cave in, would it further embolden these bums, or the others, enough to come and take more? How far will he be able to go with what's in his tank now? He wonders if his family's at risk. What do you do? By then, the first man had walked around the minivan to inspect the luggage rack. It had a hard cover over it and was secured with a padlock. He continued around to the passenger side of the minivan and was standing at the wife's window. She mentioned to Mike they haven't seen any law enforcement officers in hours. And she was worried. All this made Mike very nervous. So he reached under his seat, grabbed his big flashlight, and got out of the minivan. He told his wife to keep the doors locked, and then he walked around to confront the men. As he did, he saw Buddy walk out from behind the car. Remember Buddy? He walked up to Mike and said, "Be careful, that those guys are becoming unhinged." Mike thanked Buddy and gave him the 2 bottles of water he had planned to offer the 2 other guys. With the flashlight held at his thigh, Mike stood in front of the men and said, "Look, we're all in the same situation here. I'm trying to take care of my family just like you would. There are 4 of us, and I can't spare anything except maybe some water." Mike tried to reason with these guys and de-escalate the situation. Sounded like a good move. But it still didn't work. Just then the second guy stated, as he again motioned toward the little girl, "Give us the gas or else." Mike clearly understood that he was given an ultimatum. So Mike says, if you intend to harm anyone in my family, you will have to do it over my dead body. He then held one end of the flashlight with one hand and taps the other end and the other hand. Mike wanted to show them he meant business. By then, a crowd had gathered to see what was going on over at the minivan. It was soon clear the crowd was clearly on the side of the two men threatening Mike. He wasn't sure if they'd heard the man's threat against his daughter, but it didn't seem to matter. About that time, Buddy walks back over and tries to reason with the mob by telling them the situation, but they won't listen. Buddy then gets threatened with an ass whooping, so he retreats back to the vehicle he was working on for another family. It turns out Buddy was trying to help other people with their cars. He's a mechanic. None of that mattered. The crowd was even more riled up, and they were looking to get back at the guy with all the gas. Mike, his family, and now Buddy were starting to get heckled by people that Mike would never have expected this type of behavior. Among the more vocal were a middle-aged mom, a high school boy wearing an FFA t-shirt, and a guy who looked like your favorite uncle. Nevertheless, Mike ignored the comments from the growing crowd and looked at both of the men sternly. He then continued saying loudly, "Are you willing to harm my family or kill me in front of all these people over gas?" And without hesitation, they both glanced at each other and said, "Yes." That brought on more jeers from the growing mob, which gave them even more encouragement to these two men. The heat and humidity were wearing people's patience down. They wanted out of this situation, but the cars were not moving, and the hurricane was. It was at that point Mike had to make a decision. He already thought over what he might encounter that day while he was sitting in that bumper-to-bumper traffic earlier in the day. Even in his worst-case scenarios, he'd never even considered anything like this could possibly happen. Everyone looked like normal folks, just a bit hurried and stressed. But now Mike was being forced to deal with this issue with only a few options. He stepped back from the men to collect his thoughts and to speak with his family. Then he got back in the minivan. He told them everything was going to be all right and just sit tight. He was going to see if the men would consider some type of compromise, something to ease the tension, but not leave him and the family stranded like all those others. He reached under the seat to put the flashlight back. When he turned back to face the men, he glanced back into the minivan and saw that his children looked absolutely terrified. The look in their eyes was all he needed to reaffirm his decision to do what he could to stop this now before it went any further. When Mike glanced back, he also noticed that cars about a mile ahead were starting to move. The stranded motorists were really going to be pissed if others start driving away, leaving them in that hot, humid misery. His minivan was still blocked by the two men's pickup. Mike wanted to start moving just as soon as he was able, but first, he had to talk to these two men. Mike opened the negotiation by saying to everyone that they should come to their senses and leave him and his family alone. The first man took a step forward and angrily said, "No deal. Give me the gas." The mob was now past restless. Some were laughing, and they were yelling, "Take the girl, take the girl." They started to move toward the minivan. The anger was as thick as the humidity. It was at this point Mike decided he had run out of option. It was now time to offer them a new compromise. So he looked at him took a step back, and then pulled out a concealed Preparedness Black Ops 45 with a 14-round magazine held at inches from the first man's head and said, "If you or any of you other motherfuckers tries to harm me or anyone in my family, I will kill you." Nobody spoke a word. They just stood there. They probably didn't expect this from such a mild, meek-looking guy. Nevertheless, after the initial shock wore off, they quietly turned and walked away, but doing so while looking over their shoulder in order to keep an eye on Mike. The two men quickly pushed their truck to the shoulder as Mike got back in the minivan. He never saw anyone looking his way again. Well, except Buddy, who just smiled. Remember Buddy? It was some long, long hours in that minivan until Mike finally reached his parents' home. As you can imagine, Mike was a wreck. Though he could have done a better job of preparing logistically, he did pre-pack some essentials and did stop to get other supplies and fuel. Mike made the effort and was surprised at how many normal-looking people made little effort to prepare. They must have thought it was just a routine road trip to the lake. However, Mike was not prepared mentally or emotionally. He later said that the most unexpected struggle was in his fighting his own stereotypes. At first, he made his assessment of the other people in traffic by their appearance, not their actions. He now realized he had let his guard down. He finally realized that these otherwise normal people were ill-prepared for the task at hand and were desperate. Reasoning with them was not going to work. He knew that in order to protect his family, he had to take some drastic measures against people he thought looked like they could have been his neighbors. The worst thing anyone would have expected during all this was maybe a heated verbal argument. Something else to think about. Remember the skank in the Ford Fairlane and the freak with the sharp pain in his head? These are the ones that we expect to do stupid things. You know, like drive around a barrier at a railroad crossing and get hit by a train on a stress-free day with nowhere else to go and all day to get there, right? Your mind may have their appearance connected to their probable actions. Your thoughts tell you to stay clear of them as they may be irresponsible, if not dangerous, perhaps unpredictable. At the least, they make you a bit suspicious. What was your first impression of Buddy? Remember Buddy? And what about the supposedly normal people out there? The ones you pass every day with little or no concern. You probably don't even notice them. Not a second look. How would you have expected these normal people to have behaved in that traffic jam on I-45? Probably just as Mike expected. More like Buddy showed him. Clearly, I'm not suggesting all people in ratty clothes and run-down cars are bad people. I know there are many good, hardworking folks that have just chosen to live and look different than others in their community. Some simply fell on hard times. No harm, no foul is the way I see it. Also, I'm clearly not suggesting that all people that look like your neighbor are safe or predictable either. It's just not that simple. What I am suggesting as a consideration for your preparedness plan is that you assess your own prejudices, natural instincts, and how they support or detract from your situational awareness. To best understand if someone can or can't be trusted or are dependable is usually based on how they are behaving when in that stressful situation, not at a time when all is well. Many times, this is impossible to judge unless you frequently encounter this person. So instead, You might have to be open to any possibility. Like, be prepared to assess each situation as it comes and trust what your gut is telling you. Think back about how you felt when I painted a picture in your mind of the skank and the freak. It probably wasn't a stretch for you to accept this assessment. But is it now possible to consider that not all people that do bad things look like deadbeats, thugs, or freaks? Circumstances can make people change. Our task is to figure out how they not only change others, but how they change you as well. The other people on the highway seemed fine. Then the circumstances changed. When Mike finally realized the circumstances had changed for the worse and were not going to improve, he needed to reevaluate the situation. He did, and came up with a new plan and implemented it, all while realizing he was under a tremendous amount of stress. In doing so, he found an ally in Buddy. Remember Buddy? In order to succeed, he had to accept a new mindset, disregard his own prejudices, establish new parameters to address the current issues, and manage his expectations accordingly. A key consideration was he had to accept two main variables. First, the two men were stressed, desperate, and were not thinking clearly. Somehow they didn't feel there would be any negative repercussions to their behavior. The other people were in the similar state, desperate and short-sighted. Second, Mike had to accept a more difficult reality. The others perceived him to be a non-threatening person, an easy target. He was a meek-looking guy in a minivan. Judging by his appearance, these men thought Mike was no threat. But boy, were they wrong. Mike didn't normally travel with his .45, but for some reason, he had a gut feeling he should this time. And he was correct. Where would he have been if he hadn't placed that .45 under the seat right next to that flashlight? Consider how you would deal with a similar situation. You are stressed and your mind is going a mile a minute. You are now confronted by an obvious threat. Are you confident you have the ability to take all necessary action to protect yourself and your family? Or are you confident you could do the same as Mike? Well, I hope so. Well, that's my 2 cents. You felt you have learned something today? Please subscribe and click on the bell so you will receive notifications when my new videos are posted. I hope they are as insightful as this one was intended to be. Thank you for stopping by this second entry into my Backroads journal, and I hope you will again. So remember, be safe, everybody. You never know who you might encounter.